This is my individual presentation for Previsualisation and motion capture at Penn State. Pre-production. For the grouped aspect of this project, there are a few different types of software that me and my colleague used to collaborate with each other. For times in which we would need to speak to each other, we would use Zoom and have regular Zoom meetings. Sometimes when we had work that we had finished and wanted the other person to look at, we would upload it as to the shared Google Drive. For the ideas section, coming up with the concepts, me and my colleague Pam thought of games and films that we really enjoyed and liked the look of. Here is my contribution. I really like the game Mirror's Edge, as I really like the aesthetic of how the city looked, and some of these pictures are from the first game and some of them are from the second game, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, both of which have a very nice looking aesthetic with the neon colours and the beautiful city. We were thinking that this was perhaps something that we could try and replicate using poly modelling and lighting. However, this was just a concept idea at this stage. Another film that I had thought of was Venom, in which I had seen recently. I remembered the lab scene where the main character snuck into a lab. I liked the look of this lab and screenshotted some pictures from it to potentially use as reference later down the line if we were to make something with the lab scene in it. Another game that I thought of was Cyberpunk 2077. This, in my opinion, was a perfect game to use as reference because the overall look and aesthetic of this game is ideal for what me and my colleague Pam were thinking of when coming up with ideas for such. That's what the scene would look like, and how we would want everything to look. This game was known for its beautiful city landscape and spectacular lighting and colour palette. Coming up with many initial ideas of what we wanted our story to be, we managed to narrow it down to about 3 or 4 different ideas, and then from then on, we managed to get a rough basic idea in which we could then take to the storyboarding stage. This was my very rough attempt of a basic storyboard. I used screenshots from images of different films and TV shows that I took and used as reference, with Venom and Mirror's Edge, and the other images of things to get a better idea of how things were going to look, and also to show my colleague. The main storyboard was created by my colleague Pan. He then wanted me to finish off the ending scene because we were still not quite sure how it would end at this point. This was my rough sketch of how things could look with the ending scene. As you can see here, there are a few alternatives that we could go down, with the drawings being my main idea with the text below being some other ideas. From this point we knew the general outlook of how it was going to play out. We just needed to refine further by choosing panels to keep and which panels to take out. Some of these scenes were inspired by scenes from other films, such as the rooftop scene from the film World War Z, and another rooftop chasing scene from a cutscene of the game Mirror's Edge. Other aspects of this storyboard, such as the tool that the character is using here being the grappling hook, was also taken from inspiration from other films such as Batman. After coming up with a refined storyboard that we could then use, I looked into the motion capture and researched into the main website that we could use for using motion capture, which was Adobe's Mixamo. Here we were going to find the characters that we could potentially use as we thought of making our own. However, the prospect of using pre-built characters was much simpler and efficient that would hopefully speed up the workflow process down the line. After looking into Mixamo, we picked out our characters. For our main character, we went with the alien soldier, as we thought that this man, who was all dressed in black, fit nicely for the dark theme of someone sneaking into a building at night, as he was wearing the right gear for it. For the main villain, we wanted them to be guards, so we picked this one called Vanguard. However, to get a more Stormtrooper-esque look, we changed the diffuse matte for this character to a more white, which I think looks better. For the second protagonist, we chose one called Maynard, who was a zombie-like creature, but one of the good guys. Then for zombies, we picked a generic-looking zombie, which is called Romero. I then began to carry out some tests with the motion capture data found from Mixamo. I started with the walk cycle, however this proved to be extremely difficult as it took me a very long time to get to the walk cycle to work, as I was having issues with referencing. After a number of attempts at the cycle, I did however get a walk cycle to work in a single empty Maya scene. I captured a play blast of this, however I could not present this onto the PowerPoint because it's a video, but it was successful. The next stage was to start our basic blockouts of the scenes. I asked my colleague Pan which scene still needed doing, into which then he told me that the lift scene still needed doing, so I took into making that. This was a very basic blockout of the lift scene because we were going to put all of these together in a play blast to send for feedback. This was a play blast of the lift scene, which, as you can see, was a very basic, minimal animation. I also used my colleague Pan's lift scene in the end, as his was better modelled, and one, as it did not matter at this stage. This was only the play blast to send for feedback. As well as the lift scene, it was also my job to create the rooftop scene. Because this was only a play blast, I did very basic poly modelling with minimal texturing, as it was just about getting the story out with animation, which was also basic. One notable technique used here was the explosion at the end, in which I used PNG's explosions, keyframing them, which worked better than I expected. I feel that this was a very useful task doing a rough play blast of the previous film, as we could look back on our scenes that we created and see how they could be improved. After looking back on the scene, we found that there were various ways in which they could have been improved, such as smoother animation in regards to locomotion, when the characters were walking and running over the rooftop. I also found that some of my shots were very static and that I needed to add a lot more wider range of camera movements to really flesh out the cinematic style that we planned. Production. For the main part of the production, I was generally the animator, although me and my colleague did bits of other things as well. This here was a small segment in one of the first scenes in which the character was walking up to the automatic doors. I animated this scene with the protagonist walking up to the door with a gun post in hand. Here I had not modelled this scene, but only animated it as my colleague had modelled the scene already. This was another segment within the same scene in which the protagonist would try and get through the security door after having electrocuted him. However, the electrocution part was not animated by me, and that was done by my colleague, but I did animate him using the unconscious guard's hand to try and get into the building. You can see from the pictures that there are 2 or 3 cameras in this shot, as I wanted to capture the protagonist's face, even though you cannot see it, to give an idea of how he was feeling through body language. This was another segment that I had partially animated. As with the segment here, there was not much animation of the characters. This was mainly camera work, which was fairly simple. This was just panning sweeping shots of the zombies in the podiums, and also a wide close-up of the shot of the protagonist looking up onto the main podium. This was a very tiny segment in one of the scenes in which I modelled his hands, moving in such a way that it made it look like he was pressing buttons on the computer panel, which of course he was just a simple texture. The convincing part of this here was done through sound, in which the viewer would know what the protagonist is doing as the computer beeps with an indicating the pressing of the buttons. This was another segment that I had animated a small part of. The animation in this segment was mainly camera work and also the doors opening up. This again was very simple to do, just using the scale tool. I scaled the pods back into themselves to give the illusion of them opening up. This segment was also fairly basic, as the main character's arm would be moving across the other protagonist's chest because these protagonists were silent. There was a lot of animated acting and body language, in this case the protagonist holding the other back for a dramatic pause, to which then would cut to the zombies clutching at their heads in agony as they had just been woken up by the explosion. That was created by my colleague Pan in the same sequence. This segment was also another very simple one. It's just more body language and Maynard's hand pointing up towards the lift, indicating for the protagonist to follow, and then panning a shot towards the elevator rungs for the viewer to see given the dramatic effect of the sheer space of how big and dangerous things are in the scene. This segment was carrying on from a previous segment that my colleague had animated. This segment, the protagonist had been shot and is injured, so is limping. So because he is limping, Maynard is carrying him to the lift whilst you can see visible blood coming out of the protagonist, which were made with PNGs. This was another very simple shot, being straightforward to animate with just basic head movement and some panning camera work. This was one of the longest scenes that it took to animate, as there was some very nice camera work and movement going on. I wanted to make a POV shot from the spaceship, so I had to animate a camera as a tail to the spaceship moving down towards the buildings. I also included many other camera shots of the spaceship and the establishing shot of the building that the spaceship was flying towards. There were some camera shots that didn't make it into the final renders. I feel that while I created too many to fit in the amount of time regarding the spaceship, there was also some very minor animation done on the spaceship doors in this segment, which was very easy, and this was simply just the opening of the door with the move tool. With this part, the sound really brings it to life with the spaceship shuttle noise and the doors opening. This was the last segment I animated, which was a back shot of both protagonists running towards the ship away from the guards. This small segment was just the angle of the protagonist doubling over in pain, falling down, which was coming up to the climax of the film. I liked this camera angle as it shows from the guard's perspective of chasing someone from behind, which I was trying to create, a camera angle that enhanced the stress of the situation that these characters were going through. Post-production. After I had finished animating the last segment, my colleague then took to rendering out all the individual shots to put them all together in Premiere Pro for me to then work on audio. To start this, I began by researching websites that provided free sound effects to use. I came across this one called Zapsplat, which provided me with about 90% of the effects that I needed. For any sound effects that I could not acquire on the website Zapsplat, I took to this other website called Free Sound, in which I had used before, so I knew that it contained useful and effective sound effects. For the music, I mainly used this website called Bensound, which provided lots of high quality royalty-free music. I searched for the genre that we were going to use, and I was looking for synth and dark type cinematic music. I also used YouTube's free audio library for any other sounds and music. After the process of gathering all the sound and music, I began grouping these together and importing them one by one in order to Premiere Pro to begin the editing sound process. This for me was the most enjoyable part of the project, as I enjoy editing. The first version I sent to my colleague and was a good start, but needed much more refining with better choices in music. After several more iterations on and vigorous editing at small tiny parts of certain sound effects, I had finished the audio. As well as audio editing, there was also a very tiny part of visual editing that I had to carry out. This was to make a camera shake effect for the big explosion right at the very end of the film. For this, I found a Premiere preset on the internet for camera shake, in which I used for this. It didn't turn out exactly how I wanted it, so I did some small editing by making a very small transition effect and adding a video transition called a dissolve wipe, which had the desired effect of creating the camera shake and explosion, but also ending it right at the time after the building disappears. After this, I simply rendered out the film on high quality and we were finished. The end.